You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. You can make this possible. The New York Times soon is going to announce who they are endorsing for the Democratic nomination for president. They did interviews with all of the candidates who agreed to sit down. Not all of them did. One of them, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. In this video that was released, Sanders appears to be saying that racism is only a reaction to economic anxiety. Take a look what he had to say, and we'll talk about it.
What about the fact that Trump has touched a chord in 40 to 44% of the people? What about that issue? It's like Trump is a symptom of a widespread problem.
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you address that?
What is the issue? How did Trump become president? Not everybody, but tens and tens of millions of Americans feel that the political establishment, Republican and Democrat, have failed them. Maybe the New York Times has failed them too.
That explains the appeal of racism?
Yeah. People are, in many cases in this country, working longer hours for low wages. You are aware of the fact that in an unprecedented way, life expectancy is actually going down in America because of diseases of despair. People have lost hope, and they are drinking, they're doing drugs, they're committing suicide. And when that condition arises, whether it was the 1930s in Germany, then people are susceptible to the blame game, to say that it is the undocumented people in this country who are the cause of all of our problems. And if we just throw 10 million people out of the country, you're gonna have a good job, and you're gonna have good health care, and you have good education. That's all we gotta do. So all over the world, Trump didn't invent demagoguery. It's an age-old weapon, and you take a minority, and you demonize that minority, and you blame that minority, and you take the despair and the anger and the frustration that people are feeling, and you say that's the cause of your problem.
Clear your reaction.
I think that this guy is suffering from blind, subjective whiteness. And it's easy for a white dude to say it's not really racism. There are these other factors. And he's proven through this kind of rhetoric, similar to other people who are running for president right now in this lily white slate that's left after everybody else has been dropped out, that he has a white subjective frame of reference and blind tunnel vision, because that's not true what he said. It's not true.
Well, so Bernie Sanders has one gear, right? Everything is about economics. That's it. So he has no way of explaining how this economic anxiety becomes racist and xenophobic, right? And for all the people in the world who are facing this same crippling despair, right? These diseases of despair and the drinking and all this stuff, it only seems to afflict white people, right? It doesn't seem to work like this for other people. And when you think about black folks, for example, we are doing worse than anybody else on most indicators of economic health and wellness. Right. Yet you don't see black folks showing up to support a Donald Trump. So I think the problem with a Bernie Sanders is Bernie Sanders thinks it's always economics, but it doesn't explain race, and it doesn't explain racism. That's why that black woman's eyes look like they were about to fall out of her head, and the man asked him very pointedly, so economic anxiety makes one racist? That's not true, and he knows it isn't. Well, I shouldn't say he knows it isn't, because I do think he is actually very sincere, and he believes what he's saying, but if everything in the world is a nail and you're a hammer, then you never have another response. You never have nuance.
This is
you
why
never understand anything about race and other things.
This is why it's important to hold whoever is the president accountable, because we're subject to their subjectivity and their white blindness, and they sign, support, or write legislation and policy based on their subjectivity, and it almost always trickles down into not being effective in terms of powerfully advancing the lives of black people.
Absolutely. And if you're going to use solely a class lens, that's certainly not going to work, because white supremacy doesn't have class, because when you look at who Donald Trump's voters were, the lie they told was that it was poor white folks. Mm-hmm. But that's not who was voting for Donald Trump. So I can't believe this sort of economic anxiety argument. And if he thinks that's what it was, I don't see him winning, because it can't just be the economy, right? When you talk about, at least Donald Trump is going to say, economics are doing great right now. Unemployment is at an all-time low rate. So what's going to explain voting for him in 2020? It's not going to be economic anxiety.
But there are whites who appreciate the raceless perspective of how society operates.
Absolutely,
And
because
who
they don't
will
have to do any
support
hard
him,
work.
exactly, and will support him, those who will, because he won't look at the world through a lens that's considered of race dynamics.
And this is
that
what,
could help him.
Well, and I absolutely it's going to
whites.
help him. I think with Bernie Sanders supporters, I do think that class lens is very powerful because it does let white supremacy off the hook.
That's right.
Right? Nobody has to do any work. All we have to do is just make sure people have health insurance and that, you know, people can work and be paid a fair wage, and then all the other problems go away. And we know that doesn't happen. Right? At least if you've been paying to the last 400 years of history, you would know that that's not the way it works. But that's the story that Bernie Sanders tells. And if he's telling that story, then he fundamentally does not understand America. He does not understand American politics. And he certainly doesn't understand the needs of people who are non-white.
I disagree.
With what?
Okay.
So let me unpack this. Play it again.
What about the fact that Trump has touched a chord in 40 to 44% of the people? What about that issue? It's like Trump is a symptom of a widespread problem.
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you address that?
What is the issue? How did Trump become president? Not everybody, but tens and tens of millions of Americans feel that the political establishment, Republican and Democrat, have failed them. Maybe the New York Times has failed them too.
That explains the appeal of racism?
Yeah. People are, in many cases...
And leave it right there. So Bernie Sanders, so then the brother asked the question, but does that explain the appeal of racism? Here's what the questioner should have done. The questioner should have then said, this is what I mean. Folks, this is the fundamental issue that we face. And I've said this for years. I said this when I was on CNN for 6 years. Whenever an issue comes up, this is what happens. And our next story is going to even explain that, where a new poll says, here's a perfect example. So a new poll shows that, y'all go show the graphic, a new poll says 8 in 10 black Americans describe Donald Trump as racist. Okay? Okay? So you can show the graphic if you want to. So I'm gonna link these two things together. 8 in 10 black people say Donald Trump is racist. This is what ends up happening. You're a racist. No, I'm not. Come back to me. You're a racist. No, I'm not. So then the debate revolves around that exchange. Not the issue. Not what he said. Not what he did. Not the policy, but the phrase, you're a racist. So when Bernie is asked, well, what about the racism? And then Bernie then begins to explain what Donald Trump is doing. What Senator Bernie Sanders is actually saying, folks, and is articulating, is that these people don't see themselves as racist. They never have. The fact of the matter is, you will rarely find an individual who says, I am an absolute racist. They're not going to say that.
That's true.
They're not going to say that.
That's true.
What they are going to do are make judgments, have perceptions, and make decisions through a racial prism that actually is racism, but they don't see it as that way. See, in order for me to deal with somebody, I have to understand how you think and how you operate. And so if I say, your ass a racist, what's their response? No, I'm not. Here are my friends. This is who I hang out with. That's what Donald Trump does. He's going to show you the black people who gave him hugs after the First Step Act. This means I'm not a racist. See, that's not how we have to frame the question. See, some of y'all right now are saying, oh, Roland, you're giving us an elitist answer. No. I'm trying to explain to you human condition. That they're not going to sit here because they don't see themselves as racist. Now, press play from where we left off with Senator Sanders.
In this country, working longer hours for low wages, you are aware of the fact that in an unprecedented way, life expectancy is actually going down in America because of diseases of despair. People have lost hope, and they are drinking, they're doing drugs, they're committing suicide.
Stop.
And
So in 2009, Pew asked the question, are you optimistic about the future of America for your children? A majority of African Americans, a majority of Hispanics, a majority of Asians said yes. Only one group at 41% said they were optimistic. That means a majority of white Americans said in 2009 that they were not optimistic about the future of America for their children. Here's the problem with polls. Polls only ask questions, preset, and you can either say yes or no. What you don't have is some ask the question, which is all subjective, why? 2016, September 2016, another poll was done. The question was asked, are you optimistic about the future of America economically for the next 10 years? African Americans, lowest wealth, highest optimism. Latinos, second lowest wealth, second highest optimism. White folks, highest wealth, lowest optimism. You have to then ask the question, why? Why are they feeling that way? Now, it's very easy, and yes, we are seeing this through our black prism, through our black lens. We know what we see because we know history. White people in America are never going to say en masse, we're absolutely racist. But you have to listen to the code words and then begin to unpack what they say, that all funnels, remember what I said, race is not racist, but there's a tunnel that exists between racist and not racist. And all those phrases and code words funnel into that tunnel. So there's somebody who's over here who you can go, you know what, they're not really racist, but they have these racial perceptions. So maybe if racist is like 10, they're at 4 on that line. So they ain't full-fledged Richard Spencer, Stephen Miller racist, but they on that racial line. Press play.
when that condition arises, whether it was the 1930s in Germany, then people are susceptible to the blame game, to say that it is the undocumented people in this country who are the cause of all of our problems. And if we just throw 10 million people out of the country, you're gonna have a good job, and you're gonna have good health care, and you have good education. That's all we gotta do. So all over the world, Trump didn't invent demagoguery. It's an age-old weapon, and you take a minority, and you demonize that minority, and you blame that minority, and you take the despair and the anger and the frustration that people are feeling, and you say, that's the cause of your problem.
Now, if any of you saw the documentary, The House I Live In by Andrew Jarecki, what you will discover in the documentary is he talks about this whole issue of race and the war on drugs. He talks about how Asians were targeted who were using opium and heroin in the 1800s. They were targeted. He talked about how African Americans were targeted as well in the 1930s and 40s when it came to heroin and cocaine. He talked about the same thing happening in the late 1960s and 1970s. So when you hear Bernie Sanders talk about that, this is what is the deal. The reality is this here. When white people are feeling economically threatened, lynching, their racism increases. Their appeal to direct demagoguery increases. What we have to understand is that that internal racism meter inside of most white Americans who have these feelings, it is suppressed. it's tempered. When the comedian, guy who was on Seinfeld, remember when he lost his mind, Michael Richards? And remember how it just came rushing out, and I don't know where it came from. Because it was so deep inside, he was effective at suppressing it. But in a moment, he lost the ability to be able to temper what he said, and it came, quote, rushing out. So a lot of people are attacking Bernie, saying he doesn't get it, he's clueless. No, he's not. What Bernie is actually doing is articulating for us exactly how those white folks think. And so that's how Trump is able to play both sides. That's how he can have the little black comedian, the little court jester, Terrence Williams and Candace Owens, and these other people who are supporting him, who serve as the Pastor Darrell Scott, Diamond and Silk, Paris Denard, all these black folks over here, but then you look at the actions over here. And so what we have to deal with is a demagoguery. And that, Cleo, I think, is what he's saying there, because that's what we've seen. When we go, that's racist, it immediately is going to shift the conversation away from the issue to now this thing that you really can't prove, and you just having a debate on racist, not racist.
Well,
okay, Mr. Behavioral Expert.
In most cases, racism can be proved. But I don't think this is really the issue, and I'm not sure how much we agree or disagree on some kind of spectrum, but I do believe that racism, as we call it, because we're talking about a poll now, is such a norm in this culture that it's not seen as racism. Racism is, white supremacy mythology is drenched in everything.
Right.
You can't turn on TV and know, but a lot of us, including black people, have become numb to it as a norm, so we don't sit in critique of it, we sit in adaptation to it. So
we celebrate it.
Not exactly. So not only do white people have a hard time calling something racist, a lot of black people do too.
Precisely.
Because if black people had the clarity to recognize racism and how far and wide it is, we'd be up in arms. The so-called Black Lives Matters movement would have not went away, but stepped up, because things under Trump have gotten worse for us on a policy level, let alone on the ground level. But I think that the issue with, what's his name, Bernie, thank you, is that it's white subjectivity, because what he did put in, he's Jewish, is he Jewish?
Yes, yes.
What he did put in there was the Jewish Holocaust, the 1930s, what happened in Germany. That's what he was referring to, and talk about what happened to his people. Though he don't see racism, though he feels like these are social determinants that are affecting people's lives and making them want to get numb on drugs, or just simply economics, he did bring in the Holocaust, his struggle. Because the man has white subjectivity and white Jewish subjectivity. And frankly, people like Bernie Sanders who have white subjectivity are not helpful to black people. They're not, because they cannot see the elements of race and racism and how it affects us, because they're somewhere else in their own subjectivity. I think it's interesting, frankly, while he puts racism to bed as a real problem, he brings in the Holocaust from the 1930s.
And Dr. Carter, the bottom line is here, to Cleo's point, and I met with Senator Bernie Sanders specifically about this when he kept attacking identity politics. Yes. And that was, and that really was in a response. That was in a response to the fact that he lost to a woman. It was in a response that he lost to a woman because black folks didn't support him. And in many ways, Bernie Sanders was angry after 2016 that in his mind, that he did not win the nomination because of identity politics, when in fact, everything about politics is identity politics. Absolutely. And when I met with him, I specifically told him that, first of all, the phrase identity politics did not even come about until the 1960s, when that was a response to the Black freedom movement. And then, of course, you had the women's movement that came on the heel of the Black freedom movement. And so you had the late 1950s, 1960s, then you had the 1970s with the women's movement, Title IX. And so all of a sudden, to criticize you fighting to be treated like a full American. Oh, you're playing identity politics. And so Bernie Sanders, that frustration is there. And so, yes, when he's talking about these folks out there, oh, it's because of this, and he says working class economic anxiety, you're absolutely right. Dude, we broke too.
Right.
Bruh, they ain't the only ones taking opioids. They're not the only ones who are using drugs. They're not the only ones, but when white folks start using drugs, when white folks start drinking, when white folks start dying, when he said life expectancy, first of all, the black life expectancy ain't increased. What he's talking about, when the New York Times did a story on the life expectancy dropping, and not because of ours increased, it's because white life expectancy dropped because of the opioids. And so Bernie, that was really talking about white folks, but he wouldn't just say it. He used the broader terms, but looking through it, we knew exactly what he's talking about.
Yeah, well, I think even just the choice to say people and not say white people.
Yes.
Because you don't view all people as people.
And that's because American society has, because everything in America has been determined through a white prism, you don't say white.
Right.
So you don't see Politico do a story saying white pastors endorse Trump. You will see a story, black pastors endorse Joe Biden. So white folks will not put white on it.
Well, but that's because whiteness is this sort of blinding light, right? It's this sort of ever-present, omnipresent thing, and it's the exemplar, right? Because when he was talking in 2016 about the folks in the Midwest and talking to regular Americans as if black people don't live in Toledo, Chicago, Cleveland, right? He was talking about white people, and I think that's something that irritates a lot of folks about Bernie Sanders. It's like, we know you're sincere. We know some of the things that you're talking about economically make sense, right? We know that healthcare is a right and people should have a ability to access it and should be paid a proper wage and all these kinds of things. But when you say things like what he said on that, I actually don't think he's just talking about Donald Trump voters. I think he's talking about himself, because he is one of those people. And I think that's the thing, because that white man narrative of being lost, when you're talking to a people who are looking at having zero wealth as a community as soon as 2053, don't tell me about economic anxiety.
But you know what though? Totally agree. But here's also the reality. The last election, 71 to 72% of the total. Now see, some of y'all about to really get upset what I'm about to say. Some of y'all about to really get upset. Numbers don't lie. In the last election, 2016, many political scientists believe that 2016 was going to be the first election where less than 70% of the total electorate was white. But because there was a decrease in black turnout and Latino turnout, and then you had Donald Trump appealing to those white folks in rural America, 71 or 72% of the entire electorate was white. For all that we do in demanding Democratic candidates talk to us, demanding they have a black agenda, Latinos demanding they have a Latino agenda, the reality is, if you're running for president, you're talking to white folks. Because 70% of the total, again, folks, 70%, these are numbers. In fact, 70%, the rest of us are in that 30. And so, because of you look at our demographic numbers, white people, the reason they don't preference anything with white, because they haven't had to, because when they talk, they mean white. In the whole history of America, there was no need to say white people, because when they say people, they were not talking about us. And so,
they're still not.
And right. And so what happens? So these candidates, the reality is these candidates are doing what white folks have always done, and that is not self-identify, because it's like, well, if we want to talk about black unemployment, we mention black unemployment, but when we talk about white people, we just simply say
people.
Unemployment.
But I think the only problem with that narrative of like, yeah, most of the electorate is white because we live in a majority white nation. I think most of us know this, and we know that these people of color are.
I gotta stop you right there.
Well,
Stop.
vote.
You said most of us know.
Well,
Most
we
no,
should know.
a lot of us no. But even that phrase right there, a lot of us don't even articulate when you talk about again the power of white supremacy. We don't even say America's a white nation. What happens is even us, we fall for no. We are a nation of immigrants.
Oh,
we're a nation.
say
No, the reality is America is a white nation. And what's driving all of this, and this is what Bernie did not say, while they appealed to Trump, because it all goes to 2043.
Yes.
2043. When America will be a nation as majority people of color. So the fear, this is what Bernie didn't say, the fear that Trump was able to push buttons is because they ain't just looking at it, because when they say jobs, yes, they're looking at shit. My white son and my white daughter, they're going to have to compete now. They can't just walk in and get it because of whiteness.
And then when you look at majority minority states that are already in existence, you look at Hawaii, you look at Texas, you look at California, you look at Arizona. These
And
places,
you look at-
and they're portending what's going to happen as we move across.
When he mentioned life expectancy,
Yes.
17 American states, the average white death rate is higher than the average white birth rate.
But see, the bottom line, though, and I think, frankly, Bernie represents this too, no matter how appealing it is to some black people, is white folks ain't sitting back being passive in the midst of this threat.
No.
They are actively on the liberal side,
Sustained.
independent side,
Right.
and on the Republican side, but a little more clandestinely on the left side because it's really politically incorrect to be not supportive of all people on the left side. White people ain't playing that game. Like, we don't like y'all. Stay out, get the hell out of here. We're putting up walls, jails, your mama, whatever, don't come. But the white supremacists who are on the left with the left Greenpeace and Don't Kill the Seals uniform on, we're sitting here in the midst of all this white threat to black progress, the very life of black people through police brutality, et cetera, and basically being very, very passive.
Right.
So my question is, what are we going to do in the fact that we are living amidst white folks who ain't playing? I mean, we just got to finish talking about how they're interrupting the vote and the Russians, who is white supremacists as well, and how they have all this things that they're sitting up to make sure that they can do what they did to Stacey Abrams and to the brother in Florida. What are we going to do? And even when you talk about the changing of the country, Roland, in terms of it become more people of color, black reproduction is here. Latino reproduction is here, and getting here and here and here. Black reproduction has not moved.
Right. Black reproduction is still higher than white reproduction, but we're being outpaced by Latino reproduction. Yes.
And again, I want to reiterate the facts that our reproduction might be higher than whites, relatively speaking, but it's static. It ain't doing this.
Right.
Well,
So as the country changes to something beyond white, in terms of white people, that don't mean it's not going to change.
Well, it doesn't mean it's not going to be anti-black.
It still could be
Well,
anti-black.
first of all, we look at the numbers. So right now,
It can still be anti-black under Latino.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not
go
saying,
to Florida.
I'm not
and go to other parts of the country.
That's my point. Is you're right. Like, just because
We need to get ready. Is what I'm
something
saying.
not
What are we
white
going to do?
Doesn't mean
we're sitting here in front of a freight train that's long enough away for us to actually stop it from running us over, and we're not stopping the train.
Which is why for in nearly every speech that I've given in the past 5 years has been that. Which is why for me, when we talk about why do we do what we do on this show, when we talk about wealth building, when it comes to education, when it comes to why we have to vote, because all I have been yelling is 2043, either we better be in position to take advantage of a demographic shift, or we're going to get run over.
That's right.
And that's why. And again, so why people keep wondering, they're like, well, why are you doing this show? It's because you're not going to hear this on MSNBC. For all of how liberal they are, all black people are number one watching them. You're not going to hear it there, or CNN, or Fox News, or the broadcast networks, because their agenda is not to speak directly to us and what we're about. That's why.
But I will say this, as we are talking about these demographic shifts, I do want us to avoid doing what white people do and say it's these people because they're having more babies than us, because they're younger than us. Those are the people we should be scared of, because I think that can have negative consequences on our community. So I think we can have a real conversation about numbers and demographics.
Yeah, I mean, we can state what's a number.
No, right. But what I'm saying is, but let's not fall into the tropes
I want to be real clear.
of those.
That's not my intentionality.
I'm not suggesting it's your intention, but I'm saying that language can get real loose.
And even though it's not what you think, there's others who might think this.
Right.
I'm talking about the absolute fact that we keep hearing about the browning of America, the changing of America, 2043, et cetera. And I know lots of black people who are assuming that we're going to have an increase in power because of reduction in whiteness.
Precisely.
And I'm saying that ain't necessarily true.
Precisely.
That there's all kinds of interruptions of black progress, black self-love. The media has telling black people, do not love black people. Run the Biff and whatever these white women's name is, Becky, that's the one they use. Run to them, love them. It's almost impossible to find on a daily basis two black people in the media loving and caring about each other in terms of intense, consistent, reliable love story. And I can go on and on with all these different things that are getting in the way of black people focus on the whole concept of loving, caring about black people, and black parents raising black children to value black people.
But I want to go back to the point that you said when you said that when people hear these numbers, they automatically assume that something magically is going to happen with power. I go back to 2008, and I got receipts. When I wrote the piece for Essence magazine, when I said the election of President Barack Obama is not going to all of a sudden flip a magic switch and all these things change, there is still going to be lots of work to make it happen. So the point here is that if you take what Bernie Sanders said, and again, my reaction to what Senator Bernie Sanders said is not as angry and as visceral as a bunch of other people who I see on social media. Because again, I'm listening to what he's saying. I'm also understanding in terms of how folks think in this country. But I will say this here. There are people who are going to the polls in November who are white, who are about the protection of white interest. When you hear the phrases American values, American morals, what makes us truly American, they are speaking through a white prism. They are not looking at it how we are. And so that's why we really need you supporting this show, because we have got to have places that are here to purposely reprogram black people and reprogram folks to teach them about what is going on. I'm literally working on a book proposal about 2043. I'm telling you, 2043 is real, and folks see it. Republicans are purposely trying to pack the federal courts in order for them to be in control, because they know. And I know we're over time, but I gotta say this in 120 seconds. When you say there's a redefining of American morals and values, Joe Biden said this. It was edited, and people were like, oh, well, Joe Biden said. We talked about our culture didn't come from Africa; it came from Europe. If you heard the whole clip, Joe Biden was actually saying, y'all, this is about white people. He actually was saying that. And he was explaining why that's a problem. He was saying, look, this is where it came from. So when you hear the decline and the disappearance of American values, and what makes us America, they are talking about whiteness. They ain't just saying it. That's what they're talking about. Because what they know is that over here, black folks and Latinos, we look at this thing totally different. We look at the flag in a different way. Those of us who have been reprogrammed or never programmed based upon white supremacy. We look at public policy differently than they do. And so when you hear those phrases, you get better understand what they're saying. And you gotta have places who are gonna say that versus those places who mainstream media, who not only are going to repeat it, but they're going to actually exemplify it. And that's why it's important. You want to check out Roland Unfiltered? youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so when we go live, you'll know it.